about it as we go. Because there at the very beginning, it begins like this in 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, time about like this. The time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. Now we need to pause here because in this place you begin to see a clue unfolding as to why David had his fall. It's springtime, which is the winter is past, and if you're at war with somebody, you don't war in the wintertime when it is cold. You war as the weather begins to get better, and in the springtime, as the scripture says, when the kings go out to battle. Now David is king, and his army is going out to battle, but where is David? David's not with his army. He's not leading as the kings would have done in those days. He's back in Jerusalem at home. He's not where he is supposed to be. In other words, he's in the wrong place. Now friends, listen. Every single one of us face temptation in one way or another. One man's temptation may be different from another man's temptation. One woman's temptation may be different than her sister or her neighbor. But those who are in the wrong place with the wrong time are the ones that are most likely to give in to whatever temptations that they face. So David is in the wrong place at the wrong time, and look what happens there in verse 2. It happened late one afternoon, when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Then verse 3. And David sent and inquired about the woman. Boom! Did it get you? Listen, right here is where it happened. Right here, David's moral failing takes place. Did you see it? This is where David has his fall. Not when he sees the woman bathing. It's not his fault that he walks out onto his balcony and looks from his high vantage point and sees this woman doing what was normal in those days, to bathe in an inconspicuous spot. Most places, a roof would have been a place no one else could see. But David had a home that was elevated higher than the others, putting him in an advantage point that others did not have. She was doing nothing wrong. But David, seeing this beginning to unfold before him, he looks long enough. It's not just, hey, there's a woman bathing, but he's looking close enough to notice that she is beautiful. And so that's when he then begins to inquire about her. Here is where his failure happened. Temptation came, that's not a sin. But when he took a second look and then inquired after that, that is when his moral failing began to unfold. If he had been a gentleman, you know what he would have done? Walked away. But in this moment, sin got a hold of David's heart. In this moment, temptation got a hold of him. If he had been a gentleman, turned away, it would have all been over. We would not even be discussing David on this particular moment. But you know what happens next. Look at verse 3 as it continues. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? And so David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she'd been purifying herself from her uncleanness. And then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. So David succumbs to the temptation. He commits adultery with another man's wife, and she becomes pregnant. You saw it coming here. You know the story. But here is then the very first of several consequences because of David's moral failure. And we're going to highlight these consequences because when you're in that moment of deciding whether or not I'm going to succumb to this or not, we rarely think of the consequences. Sin has consequences. Say that with me. Sin has consequences. And David, his sin, had several here. David gets Bathsheba pregnant. Listen, my minister friend lost his ministry in his first marriage because of his moral failing. We can start naming others along the way that have had big moral failings. I think of people like Lance Armstrong. You follow Lance Armstrong's story? Man, if I've ever been disappointed over a sports figure who had such an incredible story. A guy who had cancer, who overcame that cancer. He was a cyclist, comes back and he wins a number of Tour de France titles, which is an achievement in and of itself. And then after he's retired, word begins to trickle out. Well, maybe he didn't do that all on his own. Maybe he broke a few rules in order to be successful. And as we now know, as he's confessed in the last few months, Lance Armstrong had to give up all of those titles because he was engaging in blood doping. giving himself an advantage, a moral failure in and of itself. And the consequences are, we now look at Lance Armstrong and we go, man, isn't that sad? A guy who seemed to achieve and now he has lost it all. There are consequences to moral behavior and moral failure. Sin has consequences, but the consequences do not end right here with the pregnancy of Bathsheba for David. He compounds his failure by trying to cover it up. Notice what happens in verse 6. So David sent word to Joab. Now Joab is one of David's military leaders. He's one of the great officers of Israel. And he says, send me Uriah the Hittite. Now Uriah is Bathsheba, the woman. Uriah is married to Bathsheba. So David, using his authority as king, sends a letter to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. Send me Bathsheba's wife. And it says, and Joab sent Uriah to David, and when Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war was going. And then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his Lord, and did not go down to his house. So here's what's happening. David's called for Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, to come home. And he's figuring if I could just send him to his wife for a time, he will then think that this baby belongs to him. But there was a wrinkle in the problem. Uriah is not the man that David was in this moment. Uriah remains faithful to David and stays outside of David's door and sleeps there like a faithful servant would. Notice verse 10. Uriah is refusing to go home. Verse 10. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house? And Uriah said to David, the ark, that's the ark of the covenant, and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, in tents. And my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. And so David said to Uriah, remain here today also and tomorrow, and I will send you back. And so Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next, and David invited him, and he ate in his presence, Uriah did, and drank, so that he made Uriah drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of the Lord. But again, Uriah did not go down to his house. I'm going to tell you, if there's anybody that's a stand-up guy in the story, it's Uriah. Uriah is the one who's going to become the victim, the ultimate victim here in this story. But he realizes his fellow soldiers are out in the field sleeping. The Ark of the Covenant is not in a permanent resting place. His head officer Joab is out sleeping in a tent. He just didn't think it was right for him to be pulled off of the battlefield and to go home to his wife and to the comforts of home. And so David tries to get him drunk to try to persuade him in another way to get him to go home, but that didn't work as well. And that's when David gets desperate. Notice verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And in the letter he wrote, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. And we're going to get to that failure of killing somebody here to cover up the crime. But I want you to imagine this other consequence that's unfolding here, and that is David's lost credibility with everybody else. Notice who knows what's going on at this point. Now, Joab, he doesn't know what's happened between David and Bathsheba, but he does have the letter in hand, and he knows Uriah the Hittite, and knows what a faithful soldier that he is, and how loyal he is to him, as well as the rest of the soldiers. And he receives this letter from the king that you had to obey. Joab had to obey it. This head officer had to do what the king says, but you can well imagine what's going on here. What has happened? And yet, as a faithful soldier and officer, Joab, not knowing what his king was up to, pulls back and allows this to happen. But in that moment, you can imagine Joab wondering, is something going on with David? And would you, if you were Joab, trust David in the future going forward? Would you always have in the back of your mind that maybe he would turn the tables on you sometime? David began to lose credibility in this moment. Then notice what happens in verses 16 and 17. One of the bigger consequences, as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men, and the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. Here's the third consequence of David's moral failure. David sinned, and he committed another sin to cover up that sin. Now, why is it that we do that? We do something we know that we shouldn't do, and then knowing that we might get caught, we try to cover it up. Most often we cover it up with another lie. When our kids from time to time will struggle with telling the truth, or will do something that they shouldn't do, or maybe they've been told to clean up and they sort of make like they did, and then they tell an untruth to try to cover up the first deed. We have to tell them, listen, if you tell the truth from the very beginning, or you do the right thing from the very beginning, you do not have to be tempted with a second possible failure, a second sin of covering up the first sin. And yet that's exactly what happened with David here. David, compounding the first sin of being with someone that was not his wife, now compounds it by covering it up with another sin and knowing that ultimately that sin's going to catch up to him. Let's go on down to verse 26. Let's jump ahead for just a moment.